Right, morning everybody, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the Formula One world on this planet Earth, live and hopefully well amongst you all for our live stream in the build up to the Canadian Grand Prix. And we have a very special guest who I'll introduce in a millisecond. But I was just chatting to him about the significance, historical significance of the Canadian Grand Prix in Montreal, actually. Well, actually, you could say Mosport too, as thinking as he speaks, because that was really the first safety car intervention we had in the '73 Canadian Grand Prix. It was a complete mess. I think it was a Porsche 914 of all cars, and it came out in front of the wrong driver. Well, we think the wrong driver. There's still some dispute who actually won that race. Eventually, the win was given to Peter Revson in the McLaren, but he came out, I think, in front of Howden Ganley's Frank Williams ISO Marlboro, who was actually going very well at the time, and Jackie Oliver was in there too, saying it should have been him. Anyway, it was Peter Revson, and that was the real. I think that was the first safety car intervention we had in Formula One. So Canadian Grand Prix safety car intervention. One, two. The reason that Bernie felt so comfortable getting Pirelli to take over the monopoly position in Formula One and building tyres that didn't have to last a Grand Prix distance, in other words, 2 or 3 stop strategies, or even 1 stop, was an incident in the Canadian Grand Prix with Takuma Sato when he was driving for Aguri Suzuki. And he managed to do a very good race by making lots of pit stops against the norm. And Bernie, after that race, thought, wow, that's the way to go with Pirelli. They don't have to worry about building a tyre to do the full Grand Prix distance anymore. And it started at that incident in the Canadian Grand Prix, which I'll talk to our guest about. And thirdly, there was a lot of weaving with Michael Schumacher one year in the Ferrari against Fisichella, Giancarlo Fisichella in the Benetton, just after the start-finish line going into turn 1. And after that, they just started to bring in this whole business of you can't move under braking. And that all started in the Canadian Grand Prix as well. Anyway, to help us with some of that, and actually to improve our brains enormously in terms of Formula One understanding, great pleasure to introduce my guest, Mark Slade. Mark, good to see you.
Hello. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, good. Bit of a long break, isn't it? I mean, it's a weird season so far, isn't it? We sort of
It's very,
start, then we stop, then we start, then we stop, and here we are, about to start again. And it's here on, it's head on now, isn't it?
yeah. I mean, it's really cranking into life properly now from this point onwards, isn't it? And the crews will be, before long, they'll be exhausted and not knowing what time of day it is and all that normal sort of stuff. Yeah,
Yeah. Do you remember that time with that race for Aguri Suzuki when they did that? They sort of lucked into running a 3-stop strategy, I think, didn't they?
yeah. I remember it for bad reasons. Unfortunately, I was working with Heikki Kovalainen at McLaren then, and the circuit had broken up really badly at the hairpin before the long straight. Can't remember the turn number. Is it 9 potentially? I can't remember. Anyway, there was the circuit had broken up really badly, and they put resin down on the track to do a very quick fix to level the track up. But the grip was terrible, and our rear tyres were graining really badly, or particularly Heikki's were. And I think we actually did 5 pit stops in that race. It was absolutely awful. But Sato managed to. He actually, although he did lots of stops, I think the reason he did so well was because he actually did fewer stops than a lot of other cars
Oh,
because he
okay. All
he was
right.
managing not to grain his tires so badly.
I
Um,
knew there was a stop in there somewhere.
yeah, yeah, and I remember us being basically out accelerated from that hairpin by him at some point during the race, and just the feeling, the pit of my stomach just fell away because we were just in such bad state.
Mm.
But having said that, I think Lewis might have won that race. Um, he certainly did very well in it. So it just showed that he was able to manage the tyres in a way that Heikki unfortunately wasn't at that point. But yeah, I do
Yeah.
remember, but quite painfully.
I'm just going to make sure I've got your audio. Can you speak again, please, Mark?
Yeah, testing,
Okay,
testing.
it seems to be coming. Um, yeah, I remember chatting to Bernie after that race, and Bernie saying, "This is the future. If we're going to have a monopoly, we do not need a tire company that has to build a tire that does a full Grand Prix distance." We proved it today, and it sort of happened then in that Canadian Grand Prix. So yeah, there we are. Thoughts, Mark, as we go into this year's Canadian Grand Prix after this bit of a break again,
Yeah,
and a few points to be proven, I think. One, of course, is George Russell bouncing back on a circuit in which historically he does well, as distinct
yeah,
from a circuit in which he historically doesn't do well, i.e. Miami.
yeah,
Um, and that's one thing. secondly, Ferrari might be looking good there. Well, I don't know. Your thoughts. I don't want to put them into your mind.
I think that it's another track where the advantage that Mercedes have had so far will be lessened because it's a sort of very slow speed point and squirt sort of circuit.
When you say slow speed, what do you mean by that?
The corner speeds are very low, so it's very high speed because of the straights, but the corner speeds are mostly very low. I suspect that Mercedes' advantage, which I think comes from mainly from medium speed corners, will be lessened. And it'll close the field up as a result. But we've got McLaren, I think they've got a big upgrade, haven't they, coming in for this race? Mercedes got a big upgrade coming in for this race. So they kind of fell back into the pack at the last race because everyone else had upgraded. So we might see, if that is successful, then we might actually see them restore their position. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. I think Haas have a big upgrade coming for this one as well, because they kind of went backwards a little bit, didn't they, at the last event? So it's going to be interesting from that point of view. I think the reason why George was so successful last year is because Mercedes did something to their car that worked in Montreal, didn't it? And he had very, very good traction out of low-speed corners. But when they went to subsequent tracks, it didn't work. So they kind of were misled by by the success they'd had at that event. It was kind of a strange one.
Did you ever suffer that sort of thing when you were racing?
Not really.
I mean, good traction is good traction, isn't it? Sort of within the realms of the circuit type.
It was aero related for the Mercedes, I believe. I think that's why it stood out in that they'd done something that made the car very good at particular ride heights, which it was all about rear ride height last year. And I think that's what caught them out a little bit, whereas the change they made wasn't as appropriate to other tracks. Whereas I don't recall having that sort of behavior on a car that I worked with. We had an issue with tire temperature with Kimi in 2005. He was quicker on used tires than he was on new tires, so he had to do multiple laps to get the car up to speed, and it took a long time, and he was really struggling. Whereas Montoya, with his very aggressive driving style, was able to generate tire temperature quickly. So Kimi qualified quite poorly for that event, but then he ended up winning the race largely because Juan Pablo he came into the pits when the pit entry was closed, and then he got a penalty for that. So yeah, that was tough. Funnily enough,
I would just say poor management on the pit wall, wouldn't it be? Blame all the engineers for that one.
Yeah, exactly. But it was, in my opinion. But I remember walking back into the office after the race, and it was like someone had died. And I remember standing up and saying, "Come on, everybody, we just won this effing race." And it was like it was an indication of the atmosphere within the team at the time. Kimi winning was no longer thought of as being a great thing for some bizarre reason within the team. I mean, sure, everyone was a bit annoyed that they screwed up on the other car, but I didn't feel that ignoring the fact that we'd won the race with Kimi's car was... and remember, this was the year that Juan Pablo had injured himself earlier in the season, so he was effectively out of the running for the championship anyway. It was a very bizarre situation, that's all I can say. But indicative things that were going on in the team at that time.
Well, I wasn't aware. I mean, I assumed there was sort of needle between Kimi and Montoya, but for it to have actually developed down to another level on the pit wall, the garage, I had no idea that it went that far.
Oh God, no! It was a precursor of the Lewis Fernando situation that we got a few years later.
Really?
Yeah, oh, well. And it was to do with the people who were running the team.
Yeah. And
the atmosphere that they seemed to believe was the right way to do things, and it absolutely wasn't. Yeah, it was not fun. Actually, it was not fun.
No, I can imagine.
But anyway, there you go.
There
Yeah,
you go. Yeah, it was. I don't know.
so,
Montoya's quite outspoken now. We get quite a lot of questions and comments. Oh, Montoya said this. Montoya said that. Max is not very good, or Max is lucky to have held that spin in Miami. I mean,
yeah,
give me a break.
yeah. I think he's it's a bit like Ralph Schumacher, isn't it? He's sort of trying to say controversial things in order to get his name out there, I think, a little bit. I think Jacques Villeneuve does it a little bit as well. And yeah, okay, that's fine. It's a way of doing things. It depends what you're saying, really,
Mm,
and there's
mm.
actually validity behind it. But I tend not to pay too much attention. I mean, I
No.
thought Pablo was a fantastic driver. Don't get me wrong,
Mm,
but very, very different to Kimi, and he he knew he had to do something within the team to beat Kimi because Kimi was fairly well entrenched at that time, and he successfully created a rift, which did hurt Kimi.
mm.
So he was successful in that sense, but it wasn't too successful for him because he only did 1.5 seasons with McLaren before getting the boot. So I think all in all, it wasn't
It's
settled very
interesting, isn't it? Because that you could say that was, as you correctly said, that a precursor to Fernando and Lewis.
yeah,
And look what
yeah.
happened there. Lasted a year in the case of Fernando, and then Fernando did the same thing at Ferrari against Massa, and
Well,
that
to be
ended in tears too, really, didn't it?
it did, but I would say that the situation at McLaren with Fernando and Lewis wasn't entirely or wasn't even largely Fernando's doing. He came into the team with a certain expectation, and it wasn't followed through, shall we say. And I think it's also fair to say that Lewis and his father worked quite hard to create a situation within the team because they knew they had to make a mark. So there were lots of factors, and it certainly wasn't entirely Fernando that created that situation.
Well, it's never entirely one thing anyway, is it? And
No,
I'm
no.
sure, it was a bit of that with Juan Pablo as well.
Yeah,
All drivers like to think that when things aren't going well, some of them correctly, some of them not, that it's you know not really them, and they're not getting the best from the team or what they're promised. It was a very similar thing with Nelson Piquet in at Williams with Nigel Mansell and Keke for that matter.
yes, yeah. No, I can see similarities to that.
Mm,
But the problem with it is that you have got other cars and other teams to beat. And when you're up against someone like Michael or Fernando, as a team, you can't afford to, to be weak in your within your team
mm,
and successfully beat those others is really tough,
mm.
really tough. I know obviously it did happen to some extent. Obviously, Nelson did win a championship, so it worked for him there. But I certainly think for McLaren, it cost us a championship in 2005 and it cost us a championship in 2007.
Wow, wow. Changing the subject, did you watch any of the Nürburgring at the weekend? Max
I did.
Verstappen doing his
I
thing.
did. And
Thoughts?
I thought it was fantastic to watch. Um, I just thoroughly enjoyed it. It's funny, even when there wasn't much happening, maybe it's just because I'm a nerd. I just found watching those cars going around the Nürburgring absolutely brilliant. It's an amazing circuit, completely unsuitable for Formula One, but it's a spectacle in itself just seeing those cars go around there. I thought Max just showed why he's the great driver he is with the way he was so decisive in his overtaking and the pace of the car. But then, to be fair, that they're all very good drivers, aren't they? In that at that level in that series, so that it was just very impressive. I
Mm.
thought, and such a shame that the incident occurred which damaged his car. But then that's all part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that I was talking about Bernie a little bit earlier to do with the upshot from that whole race in Canada with the tires. And of course, in the Bernie era, he went out of his way to make sure that nothing detracted from Formula One and that the Formula One drivers did their thing in Formula One. And for example, you know, the minute Nigel went over to Indy in '93, they were big alarm bells for Bernie, and something had to be done. And so they brought the pace car system into Formula One to sort of balance that of IndyCar. And Nigel was brought back into Formula One as soon as possible for some cameo appearances, and ratings were a big discussion. And it's kind of refreshing, I think, in this era that we don't get any of that. And you almost get the feeling that Liberty think it's quite good for the sport for Max to be doing that, and maybe some other drivers should be doing the same thing. And I think that's a really positive. Maybe I'm imagining it, but I don't hear much criticism from Liberty for what's going on with GT3 and Max.
No, I think it's only positive. I mean, it's the same having a strong WEC championship at the moment as well, and it would be good to see more drivers getting involved in that and racing in other series as well. I think the sensible view is the fans of Max Verstappen go and watch the GT3 racing at the Nürburgring, and the people who are fans of GT3 racing see Max come in and go, "Oh wow, actually, it's not all BS. He is a fantastic driver. Maybe I should go and watch some Grand Prix as well." And it works both ways, and it just broadens the appeal. And I think Red Bull have been very sensible in realizing what an opportunity they have. I mean, there was hardly a driver or a car without a Red Bull sticker on it, seemed at the Nürburgring. And you just think, wow, that is such an amazing organization, the way they go about things.
Well, yeah, and making it all fan user friendly in terms of the videos they were putting out and the live streams. And I mean, I mean, can you imagine Bernie saying, "Oh, I think it's brilliant. Nigel's gone to Indy and we're going to be doing live streams free," or not, wouldn't have had live streams in those days, but free TV, watch it on ITV or whatever it was. It wasn't. The whole attitude was anything that is out there that isn't Formula One is hurting Formula One. And that's why basically he killed off WEC and Formula 2 and Formula 3, put it under his own umbrella. And obviously, you know, they continued, but not in the way they could have in their own right. And yeah, as I said, it's just a refreshing change and something that we take for granted these days, I think. But it's worth pointing out because it hasn't always been that way. And full marks to Liberty for their approach. Right, let's get on with some. Unless you got anything you want to add, Mark, we can get on with some questions.
I was only going to say about Montreal is. It's a big event for me because it was one of my favourite races. The city is fantastic. It's just such a great atmosphere. The Canadians have always gone all out to celebrate the race weekend, much like it used to be in Adelaide back when that had the F1 race. I had a couple of experiences of that. There are parties going on in the city. Streets are closed off with events going on, pit stop competitions on Crescent Street. It's just a fabulous atmosphere, and I've always felt that it should be a model for how other cities, particularly, but other events should be run. I mean, contrast Montreal this year with Las Vegas, where it'll be utterly dead outside the circuit. It's quite amazing. The other thing is, for me, it was when I came into interest in Formula One. I got taken up with the whole Williams 79, 80 sort of, when Williams burst onto the scene as being a winning team, and obviously Alan Jones won the championship in Montreal in somewhat controversial circumstances. So Montreal has always had a place in my heart, shall we say, as a fabulous event.
Yeah, I echo that completely. Whether it's running along the side of the river there, is it a river? Yeah, or taking a long walk to the track from the hotel to get your exercise in, or whether it's driving to the track and looking at all the scenery and the people, all the train. Yeah, it's such a great city, as you say. I gather there's a bit of drama going on this year with certain sectors of the working community are going out on strike, which may or may not affect Formula One, but we don't need to go there. But yeah, it's a circuit that I was lucky enough to go to for the first time in '78 when it was first staged, and it was that in those days the pits were down at outside the hairpin, and we garaged the cars in the rowing sheds on the slope there where the classic cars are today, and I always have a soft spot for me because at the back end of '78 I was very close to both Carlos and Gilles at Ferrari, and Carlos was already going to Lotus in '79. We knew that, and Gilles was looking forward to driving with Jody, I guess. And anyway, Canada was his thing, and Gilles did some sort of demo run a couple of months before around the circuit. Not even in a race car, I don't think, but he knew the track. Nobody else knew it at all before they got to it on Friday practice in '78, and it was cold, and nobody had tire temperature. And first practice, first day, Carlos just went out and blew Gilles away. And I always remember sitting with Gilles afterwards, and he'd say, "What's going on? How can this happen?" You know, he was so upset about it. Anyway, he won the race, which was a good thing. Imagine winning your first Grand Prix win is in your hometown, and it's the first time it's staged a race like that. I mean, it was just an amazing thing, and freezing cold it used to be in those days, which actually added to it. In a way, it's a shame, I think, that we don't. It's kind of a shame we don't have the race in the freezing cold, because it was part of the whole Canadian thing, you know, and Gilles with his snowmobile jacket on the podium and things like that. It was lovely. Anyway, let's get on with some questions, and I know there are lots of them. Thanks for everybody for taking part in this, and let's see how it goes. So starting with the top, Sarosh, one of our members, thank you very much. Peter, Osio and Ocon and Behrman were watching a video of Michael weaving the car after he won the championship in '02 at Magny. Their joint first reaction: "Look how light the car is." Light in capital letters there, Mark. Would that be right? I mean, steering loads, things like that. Have they changed a lot?
My memory's a bit rusty, but I'm guessing that car probably was something like 200 kilos lighter than the car.
Yeah.
So
I'm sure it was
light, and also much shorter wheelbase, so very nimble. The wheelbase has got longer basically because more surface area of the floor is more downforce. So that was one of the main reasons, and more stability as well with the longer car. But yeah, it would have been much more nimble and like driving a go-kart compared to the current cars. Yeah.
And it's interesting. I was referring earlier to Michael weaving in that race. I don't know. I'm guessing that would have been about 98, 99, I guess. And but of course, we should remember the car was pretty light too, and you could do a lot of weaving and get away with it in a way that was perhaps more acceptable in those days. I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. Magny-Cours is another race, 2002, that is painful memory for me, because it's the race that Kimi should have won his first one out, and was leading when one of the Toyotas had an engine failure and dumped some oil at the hairpin, and Kimi went off on it and let Michael through. That was absolutely gutting.
Well, here's a Kimi question coming up for you, Mark. I think this is another one from Sarosh. Belgian Grand Prix '04. Kimi Räikkönen from 6th to 1st. He looked supersonic. He looked like Max from 2001 to 2006. I don't know why. He looked slightly slower from '07, Kimi. Thoughts, please?
Yeah, I think we did hit the sweet spot with Kimi in his time at McLaren. I don't know why. I think partly, I suspect that the car design and setup and aero suited him particularly. The Michelin tyres in '02 to '05, '06 even, I think he got on very well with them. They had very strong front end, so his desire to drive a car that almost drove itself, you could set the car up around that with those tyres, and it was very effective. The only time we really struggled in terms of performance was '06, when the Michelins were really, they did adjust the design to make them very high working range, so that they had to get hot to work. And that suited Fernando and the Renault a lot more than it suited us that year. The 2006 McLaren was a very good car, but if you remember, the first Mercedes V8 wasn't the best engine. And we struggled to put enough load in the car aero-wise. And also that tyre characteristic meant that Kimi struggled to get the tyres working, particularly in qualifying. Not so much in the races, because obviously once you get going in the race, you can build temperature quite quickly. But that was definitely an issue. But Belgium 2004, that was a fantastic race. That was the 19B McLaren which was actually a different car than the one we started the season with, and the car that Adrian had wanted to build at the start of the year, but for various reasons we couldn't cope with that. But it was basically the prototype for the 20 that ran the following year, and aerodynamically it was a huge step forwards. And Kimi was always phenomenal around Spa anyway. I think he's won 5 races around Spa, potentially. He certainly won a lot of races in Spa. And he just loved that track. And he had such tremendous pace. And I remember, I think there were a couple of restarts, safety car restarts, when he was ahead, and he sort of played games with Michael coming up to the start-finish line, start going and then slowing, going and slowing. And it was really good fun. It was the only race we won that year because of the late start with the car, but really, really good fun.
Just on that, the restarts, and even thinking today, how much do you do it? Would the engineers do any rehearsal with drivers on that, sort of on the build up to a lap, maybe an untimed practice on Friday? Would you practice something like that, the exact moment when it would be perfect to restart the race if you were leading it?
No, we didn't. I mean, that's not to say perhaps we shouldn't, although it's, given the time pressures of practice these days with only 1 hour sessions, it's kind of difficult to do that sort of thing, to be honest. But the drivers would certainly think about what would be the best place to go, and sometimes they'd have a chat between themselves about, what do you think, or what, and have a chat about it. So that was helpful. But I think we just relied on the drivers' experience and instinct to know how to do it. And certainly with Kimi, he was very good at managing that side of things. He didn't really need any help from us in that respect. Yeah.
Right. Next question, Mark. How would you compare Kimi to Lewis, specifically 02, 06 version of Lewis, please?
They're just very different characters, and I would say quite different driving styles. Kimi, I would ultimately say that for me, Lewis is the fastest driver I've been in a team with. When he, certainly when he started out, it's impossible to compare a driver unless they've been in the same car at the same time, to be honest. I do think that Kimi's period 2002 to 2006 was, as I just said, his sweet spot in terms of car compatibility with the car, and the single lap qualifying that we were doing suited him down to the ground, and got the most out of him. He was more, I'd say Kimi had a better understanding of the car than Lewis. He was better at pinpointing what he needed the car to do. But I think Lewis is one of the ultimate seat of the pants drivers. Lewis could just get in the car and it would be quick. And from what I heard, because I didn't work directly with Lewis, sometimes it was difficult to understand what Lewis was trying to get at in terms of the changes he needed with the car. That's all I would say, is it was a little bit more tricky to work out what he actually wanted from the car. And that did lead to some mistakes. I remember at Silverstone in 07, they went with a setup that was very hard on the rear tyres. They were running the car into bump rubbers on the rear corners and trying to cure a high-speed understeer, and it just destroyed the rear tyres. And in any way, the ride of the car wasn't very good. So he wasn't as quick as Fernando at Silverstone that year. So I think that if Lewis had a weakness, it's more in the setup side of things and getting his point across to the team. But in terms of outright speed, I suspect he probably has the edge over Kimi, as in fact he has over most drivers, in my opinion, certainly at that time. So that's it. I think in many ways, Kimi was a bit more of a complete driver in the way he thought about his racing. It was so early in Lewis's career, like the mistake in Shanghai when he came into the damp pit lane from a dry track and went off. That's, I think that was an indication of inexperience at that point in his career. But Kimi was I know it seems strange to say, but Kimi actually, I think, put an awful lot of thought into his racing. He just didn't tell anyone else what he was thinking.
Yeah, fair enough. And it's interesting you talk about Lewis very glib to say it, but perhaps not quite as technical as Kimi in terms of setup. But you made the point that Kimi loved, as long as he had a front end that worked, he was kind of 80% there. If I don't want to paraphrase you, but was that not the case with Lewis? Did he not just want a front end? And I guess the byproduct of that is, if he didn't have a front end, maybe he could do more with the car than Kimi.
I think that's the point. I think he probably could. I think when Kimi came into Formula One, I think he was a very adaptable, versatile driver. He hadn't done much racing, but I think he kind of got tuned in to that McLaren on Michelin tyres. And in some ways, when he went to Ferrari, there was a little bit that he missed of that feeling, and it took him a while to adapt. I mean, Kimi was very, very quick in the Ferrari, and certainly in 7 and 8. Maybe he went off the boil a little bit after that. So maybe I'm not being entirely fair, but it was very clear with Kimi what he needed from the car. Whereas with Lewis, he just wasn't able to explain as clearly what he needed and what we needed to change to make it work, was the understanding, the impression.
But my point is, maybe that's because Lewis had a slightly wider vernacular, and therefore he couldn't then pinpoint things because he could always cope basically with what he had.
I think that's probably true. But I think sometimes Lewis didn't get as much out of the car as he could have done because he wasn't able to get the point across.
Yeah,
and
I guess that
an example as a good example where they did some simulator sessions, came up with the setup. It actually wasn't that great, but they persisted with it through a weekend because Lewis wasn't able to get across why he was maybe not performing as well at that point. And that was one of the weekends where Fernando was quite smart in, not showing his hand on the Friday so much, and then being quicker on the Saturday and catching Lewis by surprise, because Lewis by that point was pretty confident he would be quicker than Fernando in quali, to be fair. He'd won his first 2 races at Montreal, his first race win, and then Indianapolis. And I think he kind of got a little bit complacent maybe and expected Fernando to be slower, which Fernando worked hard to make sure he wasn't.
You mentioned Lewis and his dad in 2007, and they did a pretty good job together behind the scenes. But would they have gone to the length you just described there with Fernando, where Fernando, using a lot of his road dust, as you say, not to show his hand too much on a Friday and then suddenly to be quick on a Saturday, was Lewis up to that sort of thing as early as 2007?
They were up to things behind the scenes. In the car, Lewis was always quick, and Lewis, one of his strengths in 2007 was that he would look at the data in pretty detailed look, and he would pick out where Fernando was quicker than him, and then on the Saturday he'd adopt that. And so there were places where Lewis was quicker than Fernando on the Friday, and Fernando, I think, was a little bit, he didn't really believe that Lewis should be quicker than him, and he wouldn't pay enough attention to where Lewis was quicker always, and he wouldn't necessarily adopt what Lewis was doing quicker. So we'd see Fernando quicker on the Friday overall, maybe, but Lewis quicker in some places. And then on Saturday, as I said, Lewis would have picked up where Fernando was quicker and add that to what he was already doing better than Fernando, and he would come out on top in quali on a fairly regular basis. There were times, I would say, that Fernando tried to do what Lewis was doing on a Friday and found that he couldn't. Monaco into Casino Square, he lost time to Lewis and couldn't work out how to get that. And the other one I remember is Bahrain, the internal straight, the very sharp corner leading onto that straight. Lewis was quicker than Fernando through there, and Fernando could work out how to do what Lewis was doing. But a lot of the time, I just felt that Fernando didn't look enough at the data and didn't spend enough time trying to pick up on what Lewis was doing, because he just assumed he knew better. which I think as a two-time world champion with 5 years of experience up to that point was maybe not entirely surprising. No, it's more than that, wasn't it? Because he debuted in 01, so 6 years of experience.
Yeah, and the other point was he'd never had anybody as quick as Lewis alongside him, so he'd never had
Yeah.
to do that before.
Yeah, I mean, I was told by the Renault guys when I went there that Fernando always struggled when Giancarlo Fisichella was quick. He always struggled to deal with
and Jarno Trulli as well.
Yeah, and so I think it was a bit of a mental thing. He wasn't keen on looking at the other driver and learning from him. And I'll be honest, Kimi was a little bit like that as well. He knew how he wanted to drive the car, and he wouldn't I think with Kimi, he almost regarded it as if he looked at what the other guy was doing, he would confuse himself. There was one time at Renault where we developed some comparative video technology to look at onboards, which was a new thing sort of around about 2012, 13. And we put it up in front of Kimi, and he came in and sat down and he saw it, and we said, do you want to have a look at this comparative thing? And he said, don't ever show me that again.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Okay. Got you there. Got you. I think we know where you're coming from, Kimi.
Yeah.
Don't
ever show that again.
Yeah,
okay.
Right. Let's get on with some others. Unbelievably good questions today already. I mean, it's just fabulous. Thank you so much, everybody. Jim Hunts. Hi, Peter. Would you ask Mark to explain exactly how Merck and Red Bull are managing to increase their compression ratios when their engines warm up?
Well, I can't explain exactly because I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I think the belief is that certainly for the Merck, that they may have a separate combustion chamber connected by very tiny sort of tubes almost within the cylinder head, and that as the cylinder head heats up, those sort of close up and effectively make that extra space in the compression head. It doesn't effectively, it closes that off. I'm sure it doesn't fully close it off, but if that's what they are doing, it's very clever.
And not illegal.
And not illegal. No, absolutely. The rules say you measure the compression ratio at, what is it?
But what do you say at the beginning of an explanation? They have a second.
They effectively have another. This is understanding, so I'm not sure. But this is what what one possibility. They have there's basically a two volume combustion chamber.
But that must be against the regulations to have a 2-volume combustion chamber. Sure.
Well, they are connected, so you could say it is one combustion chamber, couldn't you? They're connected by.
Depends how the rules are written about combustion chambers.
Exactly, but as I see it, it's always one combustion chamber in as much as they are connected volumes, and if the connections are by very fine, effectively passageways which close up, and so effectively prevent that second combustion chamber becoming part of the combustion chamber in use at high temperature, then you're getting a benefit from it. And I just think it's a very clever interpretation of the regulations, potentially, if that's what they're doing. So I don't have any problem with that, and I don't think anyone should do, really.
Well, no, if it's not explicitly excluded in the regulations, nobody should have a problem with it.
No,
it's the first time I've heard anybody describe it as effectively a second combustion chamber, though. That's what caught my ear.
Yeah, well, I think it's just, imagine two volumes, one much bigger, which is the main one, and a smaller one, and then very fine passageways connecting the two. And if those passageways sort of close up with heat, which they will do to some extent, then it effectively sort of closes that second volume off.
But why would they need to do that? Surely they would get the effect if they just allowed the heat expansion with the material they're using and just expanding the combustion chamber within its confines. That's how I imagined it was. I'm amazed to hear about the tubes as well.
Well, I think the thing is that the whole engine is probably the same material, and so the difference will be created by expansion is very small. So the effect of expansion on a volume is small. But if you can actually effectively separate off a separate volume, you get a much bigger change in volume, and that's why it's more significant. On the Ferrari,
well, no, the Red Bull is the next one to talk about. Do you know anything about what they're doing?
Red Bull, I imagine that they've somehow, probably through personnel changes, found out what Merck were doing and maybe are trying to do the same thing. The general feeling is that whatever Red Bull are doing is kind of a copy of what Mercedes are doing,
Right,
presumably
okay.
because they found out early enough what Mercedes were doing. This is all pure conjecture because I don't know. On the other hand, the Ferrari, just because it's also, I think, probably doing something, they have a steel cylinder head. So the expansion rate of the steel is different to the cylinder block, and they may be getting a small benefit in compression ratio from having different materials between the cylinder block and the cylinder head. But I suspect that that's nothing like as effective as the whatever Mercedes are doing, particularly if it's what we've just described.
Within the realms of everything being legal, do you think that the FIA's system now of measuring that will be absolutely bulletproof?
I think what they will have done is they will agree a temperature at which they measure the compression. And they'll have looked at, say, oil temperature. They'll have had temperature sensors within the engines, and they'll have had to agree or tell the engine manufacturers that this is the temperature that we'll measure at. So you'll need to heat the engine up to this much, or when the car stopped running, we'll do a compression check immediately after it's run, as long as the temperature's reached at a high enough level. To me, they can only do compression checks at particular temperatures. So there's still some variation in temperature. But if they can do it at a high enough temperature that kind of matches where the engine is typically running on track, then that will effectively close down that loophole. Because even if you get the engine, say, another 5 degrees hotter when you're racing, it's not going to be enough to make any significant difference. So
more trouble than it's worth, probably.
Yeah. So I think by going from 100 degrees to, say, 160 degrees, engine block temperature, presumably that they have a temperature sensor in the block or in the cylinder head that's at an appropriate position, then that should cover it off. They will need to be quite pedantic about where that temperature sensor is, because obviously what the engine manufacturers might try and do is have that sensor in a place where it's hotter or less, cooler than the cylinder head actually is, where it matters, and games like that. So all this will have to have been thought out.
But how would Mercedes go about then going back to square one and having the engine that, say, I don't know, well, I was going to say Ferrari, I was going to say Red Bull, but Honda then, let's not say Honda, that's a bad example. Okay, to make sure their engine is completely and utterly legal now in terms of the new regulations. Legal's again the wrong word, but no longer getting any benefit. What do they need to do? What do they do? Do they take the tubes out? What happens there?
Yeah, they'll effectively they'll have to make the combustion chamber an appropriate size, such that at the temperature that they measure the compression at, it satisfies the 16:1 requirement. So they will have had to, I think, assuming that what we think they're doing is true, they will have had to redesign their cylinder heads to comply. So it's not a small change.
And what about Ferrari? Do you think they'll be retaining steel?
Well, I think they said that they did the steel cylinder head for stiffness purposes, but I suspect that this compression ratio might have been the main reason or a happy side effect. But yeah, I think they will have had to do some work, presumably, if they are getting a small benefit, to get rid of that benefit, because they will have to comply as well. So I think all the manufacturers will have had to revisit where they are, even if they didn't intend to get a benefit they will now be having to check their compression ratio at the different temperature, make sure that they comply. So it will apply to everybody, and it might be that they've all had to make some changes.
Yeah, for the customer team, it's a weird thing as well, isn't it? Having to comply with something they actually don't have any control over anyway. But anyway, that's
Yeah,
another matter, I suppose.
that comes down to the engine manufacturer supplying them upgraded engines, doesn't it? So.
Yeah. Mark, just before we go on, a couple of questions from the last live stream which were left unanswered by my inability to know the answer. One was, remind me, please, and the viewers who are interested in this, on what defines the position of the timing line on a circuit now?
Well,
and the start-finish line thereof.
Yeah, this is my supposition. So the grid is positioned basically to give enough space for all the cars to position themselves in front of the grandstand, in front of the pit lane, normally predetermined by the design of the circuit. The control line is put in by the FIA or F1, I'm not sure who, one of them, and they machine a channel across the circuit and put the loop in the track. Now, I think obviously in the old days it would have been in front of the start-finish line because that's where you would expect it to be. But in order that the cars cross the control line as they enter the pit lane, it effectively has to be before the grid at almost all tracks, I would imagine, because what you really don't want is the complication of some cars' pit areas to be before the control line and some cars to be after the control line. We had a bit of a scene at Silverstone in '98 when Michael Schumacher got a penalty. The procedure was not followed, and Ferrari decided to stop Michael effectively after the race had finished because they thought they'd be clever and bring him in and serve the time penalty in the pit box at the end of the last lap. But actually, he'd crossed the control line already, so it was somewhat irrelevant. But I suspect that that's why the control line is where it is, to make sure all cars coming into the pit lane, particularly because of when we used to do fuel pit stops as well as tyre changes, to make sure that everyone's in sync, basically, because it'd be very confusing if some cars were doing their pit stops before and some were after. So that's my thought on it. I don't know.
I'm sure you're right there. Yeah,
true, but it seems logical to me.
Okay. And the other thing was, it wouldn't hurt the rear wing main plane, would it, if a human being stood on top of it?
No, I think they'd be strong enough to cope with that. They're designed for aero load, which is a sort of a uniform, or not uniform, but a pressure across the whole undersurface, with obviously a local high at the thickest point of the cord, I presume. So they have to be strong to take those loads. So they're not designed to take localized high pressure loads. So it's possible that the upper surface may not be that strong on the rear wing, and if you stood on it, you might go through it, possibly, because the upper surface isn't loaded. But in terms of the attachment to the car, the rear wing has to conduct all the force from the rear wing has to go to the car. So certainly you're not going to break the attachments by standing on it. So I think if any damage could be done, it might be because the upper surface might be a little fragile for weight purposes.
That's a good thought. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that one. Right, moving on. This is from Vicky. Hi, Peter. You describe Juan Pablo Montoya and Kimi Raikkonen's steering input through Rascasse in one of your streams. Yeah, I did that, taking lots of photos of them from the media center, which is one of the best vantage points of Rascasse. You're looking down on the entry into the tight bit, and you could see that year how much earlier Kimi was turning in and then just doing his beautiful rotation, a lovely straight exit, and Montoya was making the corner go on much longer and sort of waiting to load up the rear and then having a sort of oversteery moment coming out, shaving the barrier. But the question is, can you ask Mark about the lateral load against braking or vice versa was evident on the data? So what I just described, would that sort of thing have shown up on the data, Mark, in terms of Kimi turning in earlier and then doing a really good job trading off lateral load against braking inputs and outputs just to make sure the front's not understeering, and then getting to a nice slow rotation point, doing all the nasty stuff in one moment, and then getting out. Is all that detail visible on the telemetry you had then?
So you can see what the drivers are doing, and you can see when they're having to make corrections. And what you have to do is try to interpret what's going on and talk to the driver and say, if you're having a problem at this point, it might be because you're, putting a bit too much combined lateral and longitudinal. So if we reduce the amount of engine braking, or if you're slightly less hard on the brakes at that point there, that snap might not happen. I don't think, in my experience, we're not able to say to the driver, this is the perfect tire envelope, and if you load up the lateral here, overall you'll be more efficient. That's not something we could do. I think it was an ultimate aim in terms of modeling, and undoubtedly some drivers are better than others at judging that limit.
And I don't suppose they can do it today, partly because Pirelli don't give them enough information anyway, right?
Well, I think that's probably true. And I would argue that it's not necessarily that Pirelli don't give them information that they have. I'd say it's that Pirelli don't have that information at all.
Well, they don't need to have it, do they?
No, they don't. But even when we had Michelin, it was a kind of a holy grail to get that level of information. And you need that information to make your simulator work. Don't forget. So the whole, in fact, one of the most difficult parts about getting simulators to behave is getting a good tire model, because you can't just chuck anything in. If the tire model wrong, the driver's going to drive the car and say, this doesn't feel anything like the car. But similarly, you need to get the aero model right as well, and then all the response times of the simulator right. So that's why it's a difficult thing to achieve.
And of course, all that needs to be seen in the context of what Michael and Ross were doing at that point with Bridgestone, effectively exclusive with Bridgestone, and they were getting all that information, which was one of the reasons they were doing so well.
Well, absolutely. And what happens in that scenario is that you don't necessarily have the model that you need to define to the driver what you want. But what you can do is you can get from the driver feedback about what he wants and how he would prefer it to be, and then they can go back and make changes to either the car and to some extent to the tires to get something that suits the driver. So I think it tends to work more that way. So that's why it's a problem when you get drivers who have very different driving styles in a team. It's very difficult to optimize the car because you've got two different approaches. And if you were trying to, if you had the benefit of making tires to suit your drivers and you had two different drivers, then that would make life even worse. So what we tend to do as race engineers is we're given a tire, we can't do anything about that, apart from maybe adjust pressure and camber, etc. And then you're tuning the car to try to match the feel, what the tire gives you to what the driver wants. And as I said, with two different drivers like Kimi and Juan Pablo Montoya, it was very hard, really.
Right. Another question from Vicky. A lot of folks ask Mark on the channel about Kimi and Mika, but how was Mark behind the wheel? Did you work with Mark Webber?
No, I didn't. No.
So, unless they mean you. Well, maybe they mean you, yeah.
I can't drive for toffee. Really, I can't.
Well, is that true?
But, yeah, very much so. My hand-eye coordination is terrible. I think what it is, it's quite difficult. It is a very difficult thing to tell a driver how to drive differently when you don't actually drive yourself. But what you're doing is you're trying to create the connection between the science side of things and what the driver's doing. So the driver might not fully understand why when he does certain things, it gives a certain result. And you sort of try to explain it to him. And he can then interpret that back into his driving. and optimize his driving around that knowledge. So you're just you're trying to guide them around what they're doing and why it does or doesn't work. But it is up to them to interpret that. And outside the scope, you can make adjustments to the car. And really, this goes back to my point about Lewis and Kimi. I think Kimi had a very good understanding of those things. So you could talk to him and explain why there might be a problem in a certain area, and he would take it on board, and he would then go out and do something different. Or he would say, well, in that case, can we make the car different in that area, accepting that all changes you make to the car are probably good in some areas and bad in others. He would assess whether the change that you say, this can fix that, but it will have a negative in somewhere else. And he would think, okay, I think that overall that will be better. Or he would think, no, I don't want to do that because that other thing that would be negative would be bad. So I'll modify what I'm doing to make it better. That's kind of the job, really. You're kind of an interpreter for the driver in many ways.
And here I've got to put in a plug for Rob Wilson, because I think a lot of that clarity of thought that Kimi had, an understanding of his own ability and where he was good and areas on which he needed to work, came from Rob. Rob started working with Kimi in Formula Renault when Steve Robertson asked him to do so. And he immediately said, this guy's an absolute superstar. His touch and feel is unbelievable. And he very early on started to discipline Kimi in the way he was thinking. And then if you add the whole Mark Slade touch, there's your world champion for you. Mark, next question. It's a good one, actually. It's one I've forgotten also. I should have asked earlier. It's from Drew, who always asks very good questions. Well, you all do, but Drew is right on the ball. Could you ask Mark, or did you ask Mark, about this business of 7 to 8 megajoules from qualifying to the race? What they run in untimed practice? Bear in mind we got a sprint race in Canada as well. I can't remember what they were doing in free practice. Would they run the higher megajoules there, or yeah?
They had the ability to run the full power.
But did they though?
Yes, they would have done. And what they would have done was they then would have reduced it for the qualifying practice runs. So they would basically have just tuned the engine parameters to replicate qualifying for the quali runs and the race for the long distance runs.
Okay.
Basically. So yeah, that's not a difficult thing to do. So all that needs to happen is the FIA state in the regs that you are allowed to run the 8 megajoules in practice as well as the race, but not in qualifying, and then the teams will adapt around that.
Same questioner, Drew, or comment maker. This is an interesting point, this. Peter, I've said this before, these tyre compounds are too hard. With all the Superclip and Lico tyre wear is less, so we'll forever have one-stop races. Maybe I'm crazy, but Pirelli didn't account for superclipping. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't agree with that, to be honest. I think it's just that a one-stop race is within the limitations of the tyres available, is normally the quickest way around. And so the teams and drivers will tend to just do more of whatever they need to do to save the tyres to make a one-stop work up to a point. The thing that normally forces teams into 2 stops is graining of the tyres or excessive wear. And the trouble for Pirelli is that if they provide tyres that grain a lot or wear a lot, the drivers complain about them and it looks bad. So I think there is a bit of a dichotomy. The races would, in my opinion, be better if there were more pit stops, but Pirelli don't want to provide tyres that fall to bits and look bad because that's not good for their image. So it is a bit of a problem. And I don't know how to resolve it. The other thing I would say is that Pirelli sometimes can make softer tyres that aren't quicker. So there is a danger because the thing with the Pirelli tyres that always seemed to be a theme was they're much more surface temperature sensitive than certainly the Bristones and the Michelins before that. So when they make softer tyres, the surface heats up more quickly and they lose performance. So their softer tyres aren't always necessarily much quicker. And that obviously in itself is a problem because then the teams will just want to run the harder tyre.
Mm.
And you could even get to the point in qualifying where they go off too quickly in a quali lap, and the harder tyre is quicker. We have seen that, haven't we, occasionally? To me, what we should do is just have two compounds at each event, a harder one and a softer one, and force the drivers to the teams to use those. The reason we have three compounds, I think, is because back in the day, and I'm talking about late 90s, early 2000s, you had quite a big difference between teams. And to close the field up, there was a feeling that the slower cars could use the softer tyres, and the quicker cars, because they had more load and go quicker through high-speed corners, couldn't use the softer tyres. And so it kind of closed the field up a little bit, and you'd end up with the slower cars using the softer ones to be a bit quicker relative to the quicker cars. But I think that's a bit of an outdated philosophy now. And certainly IndyCar does very well with running only two compounds. So I'm not really sure why we still have three compounds. I think it's an overcomplication. And in actual fact, it would then, if you had a very soft tyre and a very hard tyre, it's unlikely the very hard tyre would be quicker in quali, but the very soft tyre might force you to run an extra pit stop, potentially. I suppose the danger is you just do 80% of the race on the hard tyre and then just a very short stint on the soft tyre, and that might seem a bit odd as well. But I think there are things that could be done.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, the whole Pirelli thing. Wow. Next question. Savage Dougal. Has there ever been a driver who you thought would amount to nothing but blew you away with their performances? It's an interesting question. I think I have to put my hand up and say that I never imagined, when he was doing Japanese Formula 3 and not going very well, that Jacques Villeneuve would then go to America, win the Formula Atlantic Championship, win the Indy 500, and then come into Formula One, take the pole for his first race, and go on to win the World Championship. It's not that I didn't rate him in terms of having a talent. I don't know. I knew him reasonably well when he was doing Japanese F3, and I just remember thinking, he's going to be struggling. But he didn't, so I put my hand up, Jack, and say, wow, you did it, man. Anybody that you could say that about, Mark?
Well, I was just going to say, it's funny you say that about Jacques, because when I was at Reynard's in the late 80s, early 90s, the guy who used to go to the Italian F3 races used to come back saying how terrible Jacques Villeneuve was. Again, it was a big surprise when he went into Indy and was successful he was, and as you say, then went into Formula One and was successful. So I think he certainly does fit into that category. My experience was a little bit different in that, for instance, when Olivier Panis came to McLaren as a test driver, I think it's fair to say that people no longer rated him, which I think was a bit sad. But when he was testing for McLaren, he was really good. And we really rated his input. And that caused me to reevaluate his performance. And it kind of made me think that what you mustn't do is actually have a built-in preconception of people, really. I think that was the most important thing that came out of it is, when someone comes into the team as a driver, you should take them at face, just start afresh and consider them as individuals, and you'll probably be pleasantly surprised. Unfortunately, I think it often more happened the other way around, where someone would be rated as a talent and then turn out not to be as good as you expected. But I think it would be unfair to name names in that one.
Question from Ronnie. Is it reasonable to assume Ferrari has lost some of their start line advantage with the recent tweaks and extended start line procedure, now giving other teams more time to spool up the turbo? Good point.
Well, I think yes has to be the answer to that. And that's why they were against those changes. But I think were persuaded to agree to them. But I actually think it's a bit like the Mercedes compression ratio thing. I think it's grossly unfair that they did actually, as I understand it, raise the issue when they got no feedback or no positive response to them raising the issue. They went away and made changes to the design of their engine to deal with it, and the other teams didn't. So, that to me is those sorts of things are where you gain your advantages, and they should be allowed to maintain that advantage because they did the right thing in that area.
Yep. From Aaron, hi Peter and Mark. I believe some of the aerodynamic features of the current cars, like the wakeboard, are designed to hamper the car in front relative to the car behind. Would it be legal for teams to, in quotes, accidentally knock them off in a pit stop or before the race, and or design them to be easy to fall off? Wouldn't be legal, no, to do it deliberately, that's for sure, but I don't know.
I'm not aware of any situation where that's occurred, I would say. All I would say is that in terms of the wakeboards, I think you might be misunderstanding that the benefit, you want to push the dirty air from the front wing outboard as much as possible to avoid disrupting the airflow under the floor. So what the teams are doing now is that they've been given a set of restrictions that basically force them to have in-wash, which they know isn't great for performance, and they're doing everything they possibly can to push that flow outboard, and that does have a negative effect on the car behind, because it makes the air to the car behind dirtier, and this has been the problem for years. And it's what the FIA have, I think, successfully dealt with or improved for the current generation. But inevitably, as the designers work with this package, they will optimize their car performance more and more, and that will mean more outwash, and that'll be worse for the car behind. So I think there's going to be a trend in that direction again, unless the FIA can go further to restrict that. But I'm certainly not aware. I might be naive, but I'm not aware of any component that was designed to fall off a car and affect the car behind or anything like that. I remember a camera falling off a Ferrari at Monza.
And what?
A camera falling off a Ferrari at Monza and wrecking the Ferrari that was following behind when they were running 1-2 in the race. Was that 95? I remember one year that happened. It fell off Elias's car and hit Gerhard's car, but that was definitely not planned.
Alessandro Durango. Hi, Peter and Mark. People are giving Charles a hard time, are they? For all the stuff he does outside Formula One. I'm not sure what that is. I'm not familiar with that. But honestly, I think it just helps him deal with another season in a car that's not fighting for the title. Yeah, he's a pretty resilient, tough guy. He's had enough years of how to handle this sort of situation. Charles still super quick and very fired up, I'm sure. It's an interesting point, though, with Max doing the Nürburgring, and how many other drivers probably secretly thought, I wish I was doing that, good on him, sort of thing. I'd love to have seen Isaac Hadjar doing that race, for example. He needs to get in and restore a bit of confidence. But the problem now for a guy like Charles is that if he goes off now and does some WEC races, they're all going to say, oh, you're trying to copy Max now, and so it'll all... It's so much social media, there's so much stuff going on that the best thing you can do is just stay quiet and lie low and turn off your mobile phone, probably, in the case of Mark, I would imagine. I don't know if you agree with that, Mark.
Yeah, I think that's true. I agree. He probably is, taking his mind off the relative lack of success by doing other things, and maybe that's a way of getting his face out there in social media. The team are probably encouraging him to do that, I would imagine. But ultimately, as a driver, I don't think that's going to make an awful lot of difference, really. He just desperately wants a car that's capable of winning him a championship, isn't he? And justifiably.
I suppose an interesting question would be if Max had won these first 4 races, it was great car, great championship ahead of him, potential, another championship to be won this year. Would he have done GT3 this year? I don't know. Probably, knowing Max. Probably. I don't know. Maybe not.
Probably would, but it's a fair point, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think it does reflect the mindset a little bit.
Yeah.
And it is a little bit worrying for Red Bull, I think, as a team. But also, I think it's part of his I think he's doing it because I think he does have an agenda, and I think he kind of might want to point out to people that Formula One isn't where it should be. And by doing these things, he's kind of saying, "Look, there's a world out there, and it's not just about Formula
Mm,
One, unless Formula One improves its offer."
yeah,
Uh, which I think it might be one of the reasons why we are seeing some quite big changes in the regulations, coming through.
yeah.
I think what Max has done is put a lot of pressure on them, quite rightly, in my opinion. And I think other people have as well, including yourself, Peter. Uh, but I think they
Well, and
are.
you.
Well, yeah, I think they are responding to it, and I think they have to.
Mm.
So I think that's a good thing.
Um, Mark Kahn. Jenson Button was an enigma for me. He outscored Lewis over 3 years as a teammate, but was thrashed by Fisichella, sort of 14 to 16, I think, in qualifying. Benetton, and comfortably outpaced and scored by Ralph and Trulli. Why the inconsistencies? My response to that would be I've never seen Jenson as a driver that's covers all bases in terms of the variables that can come up in a race, whether it be particularly wind, crosswind, things like that. He's not a unstable rear sort of guy that can live comfortably with an unstable rear, and he's got a well balanced car, absolutely brilliant, phenomenal feel in the right foot for traction, acceleration, loading the rear tire. But throw him a crosswind or two in the middle of Abbey when it was a quick corner, or turn 9 in Barcelona, and Jenson's going to be one of the first to want to go into the pits and change the balance of the car. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, Mark.
Um, I don't know, to be honest, about those things. What all I would say is that I think he matured enormously after he won the World Championship. And when he went to McLaren, I think he was a very different. He had a very different mindset than he'd had
True.
previously. So, and I think he kind of thought, well, I've won the World Championship, and I just want to put myself up against the previous world champion to measure myself. And what we saw was that Lewis, in my opinion, didn't drive as well after 2007. Even in 2008, I don't think he drove as well as he did in 2007. And I think winning the championship in 2008 added an element of a little bit of complacency. And I think Jenson turning up and actually being super quick kind of reset Lewis a little bit and did him some good. So I think he was taken a little bit off guard by Jenson. I mean, going back to the previous question about drivers who performed better than you expected, despite the fact that Jenson had won a world championship, when he went to McLaren, I thought Lewis would blow him away. And I have enormous respect for what Jenson did. And it's mainly from that period at McLaren. I think he really excelled.
Yeah.
The car tire combination suited him, but I think he did exceptionally well, really. And I think he was just a better all-round driver, having won a championship and got that confidence boost. And he probably became a bit more thoughtful and more a rounded person, really.
Yep. He was superb at that period. Zavej Duggal. Max said his first victory was the most special one. Mark and Peter, the day you won your first victory with the team, how did you feel then compared to your last victory with a team? Well, in my case, I guess you could say it was 85 European Grand Prix at Brands Hatch when Nigel won his first race. And unbelievable relief on my side because it had been, a fight from day one to get him a Formula 3 budget, let alone to get him into a Formula 1 team, let alone to get him into a competitive Formula 1 team and car. And get him into the Williams was tough enough. I think we had like 4 months of Frank in '84 saying, oh yeah, really interested in Nigel, tell him to give me a ring, and then not answering the phone or whatever, and this going on and on and on. And eventually the Dutch Grand Prix '84, Nigel saying to me, just go to Frank's caravan, tell him I'm not interested. If he doesn't want me, I'm not going to be messed around. This is crazy. Tell him that I'm not available. I don't want to drive for him next year. So I actually said that to Frank. He was just about to go out for a run. It was on Friday evening. And what do you mean? What do you mean? And sure enough, within an hour, the handshake was there and we got the deal. And it was a similar thing getting the Lotus deal, the March deal, all sorts of things. And anyway, when he won at Brands, it was just total relief that finally it was all justified. All the work and all the effort was justified. It was an amazing feeling. And I love that car, the FW10B. I love the livery of it. I love Brands Hatch that day. Well, I always love Brands, but that day particularly was a golden day, late summer. Great dice with Keke. He won that race. It wasn't given to him, and it was just a fabulous day. And the last win, actually for me as team manager in '92, was ironically was Ricciardo winning at Suzuka in the 14B, which was it was, I have to say, 92 was a very different feel for me in terms of my life and career, because I felt I was in the army at that point, running a race team. Mark probably felt the same way. You just go from one race to another. Everything's very regimented. You're there very early in the morning, late at night. Everything happens in order. And my job as team manager was just damage limitation to make sure nothing went wrong, really. And that often did, of course. And it was almost kind of matter of fact, that last win. We didn't take it for granted, never took a win for granted, ever. But at the same time, it was, everything went according to plan. That's the way it should have been. Quick car, great circuit. Nigel had a problem, he's on the pole. Ricciardo won. It's the way it should be with a race team. So that was a nice feeling. Yours, Mark?
It depends. So the first race that I was in a team that won was a McLaren in Melbourne in '97, when DC won the race. And that was particularly satisfying for me because I'd pushed really hard to do a one-stop strategy with both cars. And I remember Dave Ryan, who was effectively on DC's team. He was the pit wall communicator for DC. He was very anti that. He thought we were playing a losing game, but we did it, and he won comfortably. I think everyone else stopped, and we were like, why have they all stopped? And DC kept going and won, and that was brilliant. And afterwards, Dave Ryan came up and said, good job, Mark. And I was like, thank you, Dave. Because to get a compliment from Dave Ryan meant you had done a good job.
Yeah.
So that was very satisfying. The first win on my side of the garage was actually when Mika won in Jerez that same year. And I was absolutely furious because there'd been a lot of shenanigans between Ron and Williams about helping Jacques win the championship. And it resulted in a right old mess in McLaren, because Mika was leading DC, running behind Jacques and Michael, I think. And Ron told us to stop Mika first, ahead of DC, to try to help Jacques, but it wasn't going to. So it was a pointless thing. But it meant that when DC stopped second, he came out ahead of Mika. So I was furious about that. Then...
I'll stop you there. I thought the great undercut always resulted in a result.
No, because this was when the tyres didn't deteriorate that much, but the lighter fuel load meant you were lighter before a pit stop than after pit stop, because the new tyres didn't overcome the extra fuel load. So it was different in those days. So you didn't want to stop first. We stopped first because Ron insisted, even though that wasn't our plan. That meant we were behind DC when we shouldn't have been, because Mika was quicker. But then it got even worse, because, okay, that's happened. Then Jacques says, Jacques is leading because Michael's taken himself out of the race. Jacques says, I want my mate DC to win the race and say thank you for McLaren trying to help us out. So Jacques radios Williams to tell him that he's going to let DC through. Someone goes down to McLaren and says to Ron, we're going to let DC through. So Ron immediately gets on the radio and tells DC to let Mika through, so that when Jacques lets a McLaren through, it's Mika, it's not DC. So that happened, which was just a farce. And then DC was so angry, he nearly took Jacques out at the hairpin on the last lap. You never see it. But he did a ridiculous barrel down the inside move on Jack, coming into the last corner, and he nearly went into the side of Jack, and he would have taken Jack out, and that would have cost Jack the World Championship. So that was all because of this performance that was going on.
And presumably DC thinking that Jacques had helped Mika and not him.
Yeah. Well, no, DC was furious that he'd been told to let Mika through, which was fair. Why should he?
Yeah.
It wasn't his fault that Ron had forced us to stop Mika early and pointlessly. And it was just a complete shambles.
Mess, yeah.
And I was stood at the back of the garage. I was the assistant engineer on Mika's car, but I was just watching all this unfold, and I was just apoplectic because fundamentally Mika should have been ahead of Mika from the start, and all this team angst was unnecessary. And it just created such a bad atmosphere in the team. It was just a joke. I was so angry. Yeah. So I was furious about that first win of Mika's. I was pleased for Mika, but just the circumstances were awful. And then the first time I won a race as a race engineer was Melbourne, the next race, actually. I'd become Mika's race engineer by that point. And of course, this was the race where Mika misheard me tell him to cool the brakes, and he actually came into the pit lane. And so he lost the lead to DC, but then Ron told DC to let Mika through again. But DC was very unhappy this time. But on this occasion, I actually felt that was fair because, in actual fact, we come to the agreement after qualifying where we dominated and the cars were first and second, and they'd agreed whoever led into the first corner first would win the race, which was Mika. And then after that point, Mika wasn't going flat out, so the two cars were just cruising around because we had such an advantage. So the fact that DC was put in the position of winning the race was purely a consequence of the circumstances, and he'd never been as quick as Mika that weekend. So in my opinion, that was fair enough. So it was very different to the situation in Jerez. So that wasn't exactly great either.
No. What about your last win?
Last win was Kimi in Melbourne in 2013. That was absolutely brilliant. Again, I think we qualified, I'm going to say fourth, but it was very clear going into that weekend going into that race that Kimi was right on form. The car was really good, and we could do a one-stop. Whereas we didn't think other people would do that. So we went for the one stop again, as in 97. And sure enough, Kimi was running, I don't know, second or third. All the other cars stopped to do the first of their two stops. And he just kept going at the same pace. And it was fun. It was fantastic. What a brilliant result.
That's a nice segue to the next question, Mark, actually. From M.A. Khan says, Mark Hughes described Kimi Räikkönen as mega quick with a similar style to Max, Michael and Nigel, but less adaptable. He described how those three have a wide operating window and were more adaptable than Kimi. But, on the back of what you just said, it doesn't seem as if Kimi was that unadaptable. But I don't know. Over to you.
I don't think his driving style was at all like those other drivers. I think those drivers were... Michael drove a car that was very, very pinned on the front, but he would slide the rear around, wouldn't he? The car could look quite untidy, but he would just use that superb front end to get a fast lap, because ultimately, the more front end you can handle, the faster you will go. And I think Michael hung on. The way he drove, the rear was quite loose, and a bit. I think Max drives in a similar way to that. You might disagree, but I kind of get the feeling that there's more of a similarity. I think Nigel was much more aggressive. Again, you'll know better than me, but with that incredible upper body strength he had and the tiny steering wheel, he was really on top of the car, wasn't he? He was really aggressive with the car, and in a way that Kimi was part of the car. The car had to flow. He didn't like a reactive front end. He just wanted a strong front end and a stable rear end. So it's kind of like he wanted the perfect balance, which is fair enough. But what was good about Kimi was that he could work with you to get close to that perfect balance. Whereas I do think the others, I think he was a bit less adaptable than those other drivers, in that if the car wasn't quite spot on, he wouldn't be quite as quick, because mistakes would follow. Often in qualifying, he would drop 2 tenths here, 3 tenths there if the car snapped. So that was a bit of a weakness. But in the race, when you're driving it a bit less on the edge, he would make up for that. So I think Kimi was apart from the one lap qualifying when he would get to the limit quicker than a lot of other drivers were able to. I think when there was multiple lap qualifying, Kimi wasn't at his best, which was what we had from 2006 onwards, and might be part of the reason why his time at Ferrari wasn't maybe, although he won a championship, I think his pace and overall performances weren't quite as top draw as they were before that. So I think there's quite a lot of differences between them. They might have liked cars that had strong front ends, but I think they drove the cars differently around that.
Right. Thanks for that, both of you. This is from Dominic Miller. I'm assuming not the guitarist in the Sting band. Maybe it is. I don't know. Hello, Peter from Amsterdam. Love your output. Thank you very much. I've been following the sport since the early 80s and had an FW8 Williams Saudi scale electric car. I've never seen anyone ask this question, so here goes. My dad used to run a pub in Surrey in the mid-90s, and one of his punters was a member of permanent stewarding staff at all Formula One races. He claimed Chapman was visible in the stands every year in Brazil. Yeah, well. There were always lots of stories at the time, actually, that, Colin, facing all these dramas, had disappeared to the jungle in Brazil. I remember, and of course it's all nonsense, but sadly, the year after Colin passed away, the next race was the Brazilian Grand Prix, and we were all there quite early for the testing as ever at Rio. And Fred Bushell, the diminutive stature, sleepy-eyed accountant, was now temporarily running Team Lotus. And there was the test was actually dominated inevitably every year by a lovely man called Gert Kramer, who was a German, aristocratic German, spoke perfect English, and had the incredibly difficult job, working for Mercedes as he did, of trying to get Formula One drivers to buy Mercedes road cars with a 30% discount. I mean, I don't know how he managed to do it. Yeah, right. Anyway, that was his job. And he always felt that it was necessary for him to go out for 3 weeks in Brazil and get to know all the new drivers and watch the testing to get a feel for who he should sell Mercedes road cars to at this massive discount. Anyway, he was a lovely guy, Gert. And when Fred Bushell arrived in the coffee shop at the hotel, the Hilton, Sheraton, I think it was, in Rio, for the first time, as in his new role running Lotus. Because it was Brazil, and because I don't think he'd ever been to a Grand Prix before, even though he'd worked for Colin for I don't know how many years, right from the start, from the Hornsey days, he was wearing a sort of khaki safari suit, short sleeve, but with epaulettes. Didn't have the pith helmet, but certainly the rest of the gear, because it was the jungle, it was Brazil, and as he walked in, Gert sort of hailed him and said, Fred, you've just come back from your meeting with Colin in the jungle, have you? Yeah, okay, good. Of course, the whole coffee shop erupted, and poor Fred disappeared, and that was that. But no, I mean, I know what you're saying, Dominic. A lot of talk at the time that he would reappear at some point, but no, very sadly, Colin passed away. When he just landed after that flight back from Paris, and very sad. We lost a great engineer, one of the great people of Formula One for so many years. Right, moving on. We talked about max 24 hours. Sam Taylor says, why did it take so long for a safety car procedure to be implemented in motorsport in general? Hello, Mark and Peter. Well, I mentioned it at the start, the Canadian Grand Prix 73. Of course, it had them at Indy for many, many years because it was a closed oval. And when somebody hit the wall and they slid back under the middle of the track, the yellows went out, and they had these pace cars, safety cars, emergency vehicles that would go out and obviously do what they could. So it was one of the big things in American racing. And Formula One people in general never really took much heed of what was going on in America, in my opinion, at that time, and we knew better. a similar thing to Jim Hall putting a high wing on the Chaparral in '67 and winning races with it in Europe, and yet not making any impact at all on the brains of people like Colin Chapman or Enzo Ferrari. And they did their own thing and started with little spoilers at Spa and little wings in '68. And eventually, of course, they copied the Chaparral wing by mid '68. But it took them a while for the penny to drop. And I think that was characteristic of it. And in the case of Formula One back then, the last thing, as I said, the last thing Bernie would ever want to have done would have been to have seen to be copying anything the Americans were doing was going on in IndyCar. It was just anathema to him to do that. But when Nigel went there in '93, and the ratings started to fall in Formula One and go up on ITV, who did have the rights in the UK, Bernie looked for a quick fix and said, oh, well, they got these pace cars. They go out and when the race is boring, they just put a pace car out and they restart the race. We've got to have that in Formula One. Let's start all that. And that's why it all came in. And that's why Bernie, it wasn't a proper safety car when it first appeared at Imola. Well, that in beginning of '94, actually. It was in Brazil and other races, but it was really only used for the first time in Imola '94 at the start, after the start line shunt. And it was just an Opel road car with normal brakes and tyres. And Max Angelelli drove the car on Thursday afternoon and said to Charlie Whiting, this is a joke. I mean, one lap and the brakes have gone, the tyres have gone. What do you want me to do? And Charlie sort of shrugged, and Max went off to the Porsche Super Cup paddock where he knew the people and managed to persuade them to give him the Porsche Celebrity Turbo 911 that wasn't being raced that weekend to use as a safety car. And he took it back to the pit lane, got it stickered up and ready to go. And as soon as Bernie saw it, he said, what's that doing there? And Max said, well, this is a much better car than that Opel. I mean, if you want me actually to go out and lead the race as a safety car, this is the nearest we can get to something that's acceptable. Bernie said, take all those stickers off. I want the Opel. I don't want any other car. I want the Opel. And that was it. So they went back to the Opel. And I think it was because Bernie had done a deal with the local dealer or something, or with Opel or whatever, I don't know. But they went back to this ridiculous road car, and that led, of course, to those absurd laps that Ayrton had to do behind the safety car. They should never even have deployed the safety car. They should have just stopped the race and restarted it once they'd cleared the track. But because Bernie was very keen to get the safety car out there and show that Formula One could have a safety car too, pace car. They call it safety car, so it wasn't the same as America. And, we all know what happened after that when the tire pressures went down, the temperatures went down. There you go. Sashin Seshtari. Hi, Peter. I'm staggered that drivers can remember 150 plus corners at the Nürburgring. That too, sleep deprived in the middle of the night. Aren't racing drivers the most cerebrally gifted of athletes? Well, they are. And they're not only cerebrally gifted, they're physically gifted. And if you think about what they have to do in a racing car and the different physical attributes required to drive a car well, it is probably the most difficult sport in the world. And we've seen that. We don't see it very often these days, but whenever there was a multi-sport competition involving athletes from the top of all their different things, racing drivers always did incredibly well. Jody Scheckter, Jackie Stewart, Nigel being very good examples. When you think about Jackie Stewart was a crack clay pigeon shot, Olympic standard. James Hunt was junior Wimbledon standard tennis player. Nigel Mansell, also very low handicap golfer. But how many golfers can get in a Grand Prix car and do a job? How many clay pigeon shooters can get into a Tyrrell and win the Monaco Grand Prix? So it is, that's why we love motor racing, because Formula One drivers are just amazing. But I'd just like to throw this over to Mark, because I'm interested to know from you, Mark, how quickly, in your experience, drivers like Kimi learn to circuit?
Instantly. Absolutely unbelievable how they did it. In fact, and this takes me back to Kimi and Juan Pablo Montoya again. So we had just got the simulator up and running at McLaren sort of around that time, starting to use it. Had been going for a while, but we started to use it seriously in 2005. And Juan Pablo would go in, because we had a number of new circuits in '05. Istanbul, the race in Turkey was one. I think we had another one. I can't remember where it was. I think we had a couple of new races that year, and Kimi refused to use the simulator, and he made a point of being faster than Juan Pablo, who spent days in the simulator at those two new circuits. That was all he was interested in. He was just like, he wanted to be fastest in P1, and he was. But they go out. I mean, look at a track in wet conditions that they've never seen before, on tyres that they haven't run before. Yeah, most of the time they go out and they're instantaneously quick. It's unbelievable. The one that really stands out for me was I think it was Spa. I can't remember which year it was. I think 98 or 99 potentially. On the Friday, it rained between P1 and P2. And I remember Michael jumped in his car and went out first, quite a long time before anybody else went out. And the times he set on his out lap were unbeaten for about 15 minutes by anybody else. And I was blown away. I just thought, that is incredible. And no one else even noticed. But I just remember looking at those sector times, obviously sector 2 and sector 3. And then obviously he did a sector 1 on his first time lap. And it was utterly mind-blowing how quick he was. And it wasn't because the track was dry at the start. It had rained, and it didn't then get slower. So it wasn't that. He actually went out. There was loads of standing water. No one else even dared go out at that time. There was too much water on the track. And he was incredible. Absolutely incredible. That's when I take my hat off to these guys. The other ones used to be those one-lap qualifying runs, and it would start raining, and they'd have to go and do their one lap of qualifying, say 2004, 2005, on tyres and in track conditions with a car that we changed the setup of, and they'd never run it before, and they'd be unbelievably quick. It was so impressive.
I mean, Jim Clark's book, he says that if he can't learn a circuit in 6 laps, then he shouldn't be a racing driver.
Yep.
And I'm not sure if he means the Nürburgring long circuit as well, but don't forget Jimmy in 62 in the 1.1 litre Lotus 23 led the Nürburgring 1,000 kilometers by a massive margin over the big 4.5 litre Ferraris until an exhaust manifold went and just disappeared into the distance. And I think he'd only done one race at the ring before then. And my experience, different from Mark's, but I was lucky enough to do a couple of laps of the Nürburgring with Mark Donoghue in 75 in Mark's black 911. And the first lap we did, he said, "Hey, do you know this track?" I said, "Well, I've done a few laps with Carlos and a few others." And he said, "Oh, yeah, I did a couple of laps yesterday. Anyway, it's cool. It's great, isn't it?" He didn't use the word cool. It's great. He loved it. Anyway, he then talked his way around the lap. He told me exactly what corner was going to happen next. And he was going quickly in the 911. And he can't have done more than about 5 laps at that point, I think, of the Nürburgring. And he knew exactly what was coming next. Mark Donoghue. I mean, the skill of these guys, and that's why this show works. That's why Mark and I, get on the way we do, and Scarbs, because we're all in awe of the skill level of these athletes. And I'm in awe also of the engineers, I got to say, and all these people that create the cars as well, and people like Mark, I got to say that. So anyway, it's a great subject, and there are so many examples of drivers learning things so quickly. And another example, just a slightly tangential thing, is when Nigel, part of this business of trying to get Nigel into Formula One, we got him into a Lotus. Yeah, right. We got him a deal at Lotus whereby he was a van driver going around England checking on supplies and stuff, and with the hope that one day he might get a chance to prove his ability. And this is in 1980 or 79 actually. And I said to Nigel, the one thing you need to do, Nigel, is with the money you're going to get paid as a van driver, which wasn't a lot, invested in getting your private pilot's license, because if you ever do meet Colin in a corridor somewhere, he'll be impressed that you've got a license and you can talk flying with him, which is what he loves. And Nigel did that, and he went solo in 15 hours, just like that. Bang, no problem at all. So they're very skilled guys, these racing drivers, very, very skilled.
Can I tell you a quick story?
Yeah.
To me, highlights it. In the Rugby World Cup was in Japan when Daniel Ricciardo was driving for Renault. So that would have been what, 19 or 20? Yeah, and they set up in the paddock. They basically gave Danny a rugby ball, and there was a big dustbin on the other side of the paddock. It's just quite big, quite wide. And I said to Daniel, have you ever played rugby? He's like, no, I haven't. He said, oh, well, do you think you can kick the ball into that bucket, 30 meters over there or however far it was? I can't remember. And he was like, well, I'll give it a go. And he drop kicked it, and it went straight in the bin. It was just, it was one of those sort of jaw drops moments.
Yeah.
It's just like, how does that happen?
Yeah.
The hand-eye, just the physical coordination.
Yeah.
It's just on another level. Unbelievable.
And Nigel these days expresses it with card tricks and magic stuff. It's all just very, very quick hand-eye action, coordination.
Fernando does card tricks. He used to do
and juggling. They're all good jugglers too.
Yeah. Mika went to circus school. Mika Hakkinen went to circus school. That was his training. So he could, when they stand on a ball and sort of roll around, he can do that, no problem. And he used to ride around the F3 paddock on a motorcycle.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of that. Yeah.
It's astonishing, and that is the difference between them and normal people in many ways.
Yeah,
that incredible sense of that balance and physical response. They're just on a different plane.
Regular viewers of this channel will know that I love rallying, and one of the reasons I love rallying these days is because it allows me to get very close again to sheer car control on very low grip surfaces, particularly gravel. And I just love to see that. It's just like rebooting my enthusiasm for what these guys can do in a very visual way. Not that you can't see it in a Formula One car, but it's less obvious. You've got to work harder to see exactly what everybody's doing. But in rallying, it's pretty much in your face. And I was at this rally last weekend, and I'm going to try and show this video now. It probably won't work because you know what it's like trying to do things. It's only a 5-second video. 13 seconds actually. And there's this guy, Juan Antonio Suarez, who's unbelievably good. Believe me when I tell you, this guy's car control is second to none, and he would hold his own in any sort of car control test amongst Formula One drivers. He's just fabulous. And what I videoed here was it was at a break, and there were about 4 stages to go, and he wanted to look at his onboard of his previous run on the stage that he was about to do. And it was about a 13-minute stage. And he just sat there watching this video. And I videoed 13 seconds of it because I was blown away by the concentration. He doesn't move at all in the video. And he's just staring at the screen, living the moment on the onboard. Let me see if I can do it now. It's not going to be, yeah, he's the guy in the middle with the glasses, right? It's not that sharp, sadly. Maybe I can implement that. And he's just staring at it. It just doesn't move. Everybody else is moving, and he's just like, it doesn't matter what's going on around him. He was completely oblivious to it. And I love watching onboards looking up at the face of the driver in Formula One when the light is good enough to be able to see the eyes. And I love to see the facial expressions of drivers when they're on the limit and the look of concentration they have. And we get that. We don't get enough of it, actually, I think, in Formula One. They do a good job with the onboards, but I'd love to see more of that. And that's another thing you see in rallying. You see the facial expressions. You see, it's interesting with Ollie Solberg. He's always got his mouth open when he's about to do something dramatic. There's a lot of pictures of Jim Clark with his mouth open too. But I think photographers like Michael Cooper always said he was actually being quite rude to them at the time and shouting at them. But anyway, good question. Thank you very much indeed for that. Let's have a look at Herbert Williams says, sorry, I'm just going to have to bring up the visual again on this. 1 second. Herbert Williams says, I've never seen a Formula One race. Is Michael Schumacher able to win the Indy 500? Michael Schumacher. Well, sadly not now. He's not well. But yeah, I mean, Formula One drivers have gone over to Indy and won the Indy 500, or vice versa in the case of people like Jacques. So Yeah, and Nigel, lots of them, Jim Clark, Graham Hill, have done that. Some Formula One drivers have not adapted to Indy. You're talking about the 500 drivers like Rindt, who always found it made him a bit sick. Interestingly, Pedro Rodriguez probably never really had a decent car. Jack Brabham was always good. He started the whole rear engine revolution at Indy. So, yeah, there's a lot of history there of Formula One and Indy. And, of course, the Indy 500 was a round of the World Championship for many years in the 50s. Hi, Mark. Can you talk more about that night after P1 in qualifying, Brazil 22? How did you guys celebrate? Did you buy everyone dinner, like you said on the team radio? Thank you. We appreciate these streams.
Yeah. So that story is that on the drive into the circuit in the morning, we'd been chatting about, how well things were going to go. And then someone said, we might even get on pole today. This is with Kev Magnussen. And I said, if we get on pole, I'll buy everybody dinner. And then sure enough, we did. It was incredible because Kev pulled out the most unbelievable lap when the session was opened and it was wet. And I think Max was second on the road and Max wasn't as quick as Kev. That's the thing that stood out to me. It wasn't just because then I think the Ferraris went out and held everybody up because they wanted to try and create a gap or something. But the other drivers weren't able to set times. But Kev beat Max on the one lap that there was available, which was phenomenal. But that evening, we got back really late, so there wasn't time to have dinner that night. So we actually did that the following year. So I did buy dinner for the guys who were in that car on the way to the track the following year in the Fogo de Chão in the Marumbi shopping centre. But that evening, we actually went down to the bar and Kev bought everybody beer at the hotel bar. That was in the Hyatt in Sao Paulo. So that's all we did. We just had a beer. And then the next day, Kev had to hang on in the sprint race to try and score a point, which he did, which was really hard in that car because the car really wasn't very good. But in the dry, he managed to hang on to 8th and score a point, which was great. So great. That was a fabulous day. I was so pleased for him because Kev is a phenomenally talented driver, and he did deserve to do better results than he actually did in Formula One, in my opinion. But then his dad was super talented as well, so I'm not sure what happened with both of them. I think there was a bit of a mental attitude thing that didn't quite work out for them. I don't know. Did you watch Kev in the Spa race, WEC race?
I didn't watch it. He went quite well there, didn't he? Finished in the top 5th or something.
He was running second.
Was he?
And the other BMW was first, and he set out to hold up Fuoco's Ferrari at the restarts.
Oh, cool.
He was phenomenal what he did. Firstly, he dropped back too far from the other BMW, so he was pushing the limit. So the other BMW was able to go without any threat from behind because Kev was holding them up. And then he drove the most unbelievable last 20 laps, keeping Fuoco's Ferrari, which was quicker, behind. And basically, that's why the other BMW won the race, because of the job Kev did, keeping Fuoco behind. Absolutely phenomenal.
So that was Michael and Mika revisited from Malaysia, right? 99.
I guess it was a little bit like that, yeah. Except in that race, Mika couldn't afford to have a shunt. So he had to be a little bit conservative. So Michael really did the number on him there.
Yeah.
But,
Moran continues, it's a nice segue. How would you compare Kevin with Ocon?
In my opinion, Kev's a far better driver. I think Ocon is potentially quick, but he has some real issues.
Really?
It'd be unfair for me to go into it, but another engineer of Esteban's has described him as uncoachable, and that says it all, unfortunately.
Well, from that, I gather that he perhaps what that means is that he's probably not very self-critical. But anyway,
I was blown away in Shanghai when Esteban said, "Yeah, that was my fault," when he tangled coming out of the pit lane with, I can't remember who it was. It's the first time I've ever heard Esteban Ocon accept responsibility for something.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's all I
Connor
need.
Clark, a big thanks to Connor for sending some great pictures of Mondello Park where Derek Daly was doing his book signing, and also from the Nürburgring. Hope you enjoyed it there, Connor. My apologies, I've not had the time to download everything yet, but I'll definitely put them on the communities page, put a selection up there. Thank you for those, Connor. And a nice message from you. Hi, Peter. Thanks to you and Mark for the show. Remember to everyone watching to give this video a like and to subscribe to the channel if they haven't already. Well, thank you very much. Nice of you to say that. Gandalf the Fool says, hi, Peter and Mark. He both well. Thank you very much. Yeah. Srinayan, are you right for time, Mark, by the way?
Yeah.
We'll give this another 10 minutes. Hi, Peter. Always a pleasure listening to both of you speak about the sport. Do you think Formula One is moving in a direction where the focus is shifting more towards viewership, media, and publicity, to the point that the sport risks losing what makes the racing truly enjoyable and thrilling for drivers and fans who follow Formula One on a deeper level? I know where you're coming from and the sort of thing we were talking about at the start of the year. I certainly think that Miami was a step forwards, and I think the teams, Liberty and Formula One, now have a better feel for where they want to go with these electrified regulations, for want of a better word, and we're heading to a good future, I think, in many ways. And I think the rest of this year is going to be fascinating, to be honest. Certainly Kimi versus George is not going to go away as a battle that's going to be the backbone of the season, probably. Ferrari sniffing around, hopefully winning some races. Max Verstappen hopefully can only get better from here on in with Red Bull. And McLaren, right there, absolutely. So I think it's going to be a very good year now from here on. I mean, I'm not a fan still of diluting the entry to some of the very quick corners, but it didn't look too bad in Miami. So let's see how it goes in Canada. Your thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think they made a terrible mistake with the rules as they set out at the start of the year in Melbourne. And for me, the race in Suzuka was just dire, or particularly in qualifying, the way the drivers were having to lift off on the entries. It was just a disgrace, to be honest. But the positive is that I think that it has been recognised, and the changes that were made for Miami, I think, were a small step in the right direction. I think a lot of why it looked better in Miami was because of the circuit. So I think there are still going to be issues, but at least they've announced the changing the energy split for next year, aren't they, to make it more 60-40, which again will be another step forward, another improvement, and lead to less of the recovery. And they're talking about V8s for, I'm not sure what year that is, it 28 or 29? So
30, I thought it was.
Is it 30? Okay. So I think that again shows that there's a recognition of the problem, but I just think it should never have happened. They shouldn't have got to this position, and they put themselves in massive jeopardy. And I think the realization of what jeopardy they're in with the viewers is why they're having to make quite big changes quite quickly. But frankly, I think they should never have got in that position. They should have listened to the people who told them that there were going to be problems. And it's very disappointing that they didn't, but at least they are responding to it and making appropriate changes now. So thank goodness for that. It means hope is not lost, and it will get better.
Gandalf the Fool wants Mark to tell us about the most exhausting race he's ever had in his career.
The most exhausting race? Well, I was really ill in Shanghai one year, and I actually almost fell off the pit wall and had to go back to the hotel straight away afterwards because I was so ill. But I can't even remember what year that was.
Was it a McLaren year or?
No, I think it was a Lotus. So it was either with Kimi or it might have been with the great Vitaly Petrov. Even I'm not sure. Can't remember. The most stressful race I think was Spa with Mika in 2000, because unknown to Mika and to all the fans, we believed that the engine was going to run out of oil before the end of the race. So we were expecting the engine to explode. And I just remember I used to stand on the pit wall in those days. I didn't used to sit because I found sitting too restrictive. So I didn't have it. Ron didn't like it because the pit wall wasn't symmetrical, because there used to be they'd all used to sit and I'd be standing, and he didn't like that, but he let me do it. But at the end of the race, I just my legs pretty much gave way, and I had to sit down because the engine did make it unbelievably. I mean, Spa is a tough place for an engine in terms of oil supply. And what had happened was the engine engineer, who shall remain nameless, there was an auxiliary oil tank which had a little flutter valve, which used to vibrate away and allow a trickle of oil into the main oil tank to top it up. And he'd set the frequency an order of magnitude too high. So instead of sort of 10 per second, it was doing 100 flutters per second or something, which basically meant the oil wasn't getting out of the auxiliary oil tank. It was there, but you couldn't the engine. And they obviously noticed that the main oil tank level was dropping during the race. And this is while Mick is battling with Michael and, the famous pass either side of Zonta going down the straight. We were just expecting the engine to fail, but it didn't. So
did it cross your mind to let Mika know there was a potential issue?
No, absolutely not. There's just no point. It would have just disheartened him. So there's many times when you have to choose whether to tell drivers things or not. And basically anything that's going to be negative to the driver, and it's not going to help them to know, is it?
Nothing you can do.
No, absolutely. It was a bit like, well, the other one that didn't work was Mika's clutch in Barcelona in 2001 when it was wearing out, and it did fail on the last lap when he didn't win. But again, there was no point telling him that was happening, so we didn't. We only told him afterwards what had happened. There's so much stress, you wouldn't believe it. So much.
Another question. Hi, Peter and Mark. This is from Nissam. Question for Mark. How advanced is the McLaren Technical Centre? Is it what entices some of the best talents to work for McLaren? I've just been rereading a bit of Adrian's book about how he got reprimanded for not walking down the corridor, because he always used to like to go in the back entrance and hated that business of walking down the corridor to the race shop. Did you always use the corridor, the correct entrance, Mark?
I didn't start with, and we got told in no uncertain terms that we were not allowed in the back door because they were told it was health and safety, because we'd have to cross the yard at the back to get in the back door. And there weren't any
terribly dangerous.
It was terribly dangerous. We were banned from the backyard. So I did use the corridors in the end, but it was a faff. You had to go down what were called the Fosteritos, which were the little spiral staircases that led from the car park down to the lower level. Then you went along this very white corridor, white tiles, both on the floor and on the walls and on the ceiling, through these big, heavy, massive doors. And then you came up another set of staircases into the drawing office. So fascinating. And apparently they wanted to film a James Bond film in there. They asked if they could, and Ron said no, because he thought they would damage the building. And he's probably right, actually, to be fair. My camera's frozen. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's unfrozen now. It happens periodically, I think.
Yeah.
But so what you're saying is basically there's nothing there to entice the world's best engineers to go to McLaren.
It's funny. To be fair, as a facility, it's all part of the image, isn't it? And it made you feel special. That's what I would say. When I worked for McLaren, you felt that you worked for something big, and you felt, well, because I work for McLaren, I must be a big deal as well to some extent. It made you feel special, and I think that's one of the things that Ron did very well. And I would have to say, at the other teams I worked at, you never had that feeling, not the same feeling. I guess they probably have that feeling at Ferrari as well. But it was a big deal to feel part of McLaren, and you were doing something special. But those other teams, what I mean is, I felt special to work with great people at those teams, but I didn't feel that the people who ran those teams went out of their way to make their employees feel special, which Ron did. He could be quite unpleasant with people, and some of the conditions were a bit unpleasant, like not allowed to spill things, not allowed to have coffee in the drawing office and stuff like that. That was a pain in the arse. But at the same time, you kind of understood why, because when it looked so fantastic, it made you feel good. So I understand that. And when I went to Renault in 2010, the garage at the track was filthy. I couldn't believe how scabby it was. It was just a mess. And immediately it had an impression on me. It made me feel less good. And the other thing I remember is Nick Heidfeld, where he test drove for McLaren. when he was put into the Prost, I think it was, Silverstone test, he was supposed to drive for us, and then because the deal had been done, he was actually going to drive for Prost. He turned up and he arrived at our garage, and we said, "Sorry, mate, you've got to go down there." So he went down to Prost, and then I remember him coming back at lunchtime, and he came back in the garage. He said, "The car, it's dirty," and we were like, "Yeah." And it was just one of those things that made me realise what was special about McLaren. He went down there and he saw the car was dirty, and he obviously was thought, well, if the car's dirty, what else is not right about this car? And I started to realise the importance of psychology in all of this, which was something that Ron was very hot on. And I always used to sort of tell the guys around my car, if I saw that the car was dirty at all after they'd hurried to put it together, I appreciated what they'd done. But if there was some fingerprints in it, I'd say, get those fingerprints off the car before the garage comes in. Make the car look good. We need to look good. We need to look professional. It's really important.
Interesting cleanliness in Formula One. I remember I had a long chat to Ron once about his early days when he was a mechanic at Brabham, actually, when Jack was almost won the World Championship in 1970. And when he first joined Brabham, it was just as a mechanic, Ron Dennis, he thought, how can I be different from all the other mechanics? How can I do a better job? And he came to the conclusion that what he would do differently from all the other mechanics is that when they did the strip down of the car between races, he would personally clean every part of the car in a way that racing mechanics never did. And that was what distinguished Ron right at the start of his career. And I've also got something to add about the Nick Heidfeld story, because that doesn't surprise me at all for one simple reason. I first saw Nick Heidfeld drive at Macau in Formula 3 when he was racing for Bertrand Schaefer Racing. Bertrand, great guy, lovely guy. And he was very, very quick that year. I think he was on the pole, actually. He was very fast. And I remember walking down at the end of practice, down towards the hotel. We were going to have dinner or whatever that night. Walked past Bertrand's garage, and Nick Heidfeld had a broom in his hand, and he was sweeping the garage floor. And he just got the pole for the Macau Grand Prix. So that's where it all came from, Mark. That's where the whole cleanliness thing came from. He was well brought up by Bertrand Schaefer. Brilliant. Yeah. I love, I've always been a fan of Nick ever since then, actually. He was I thought, a very underrated driver in many ways. We didn't see the best of him in Formula One, but very talented. Moving on. So... we haven't got too much time, so I'm going to Herbert Williams says he's just been invited to the Canadian Grand Prix. Well, go Herbert, and enjoy. Miran says, Mark, 24 Montreal, K-Mag's start was sublime. Shame about the pit stop. What happened there? Miscommunication. And Herbert joins in, and I miss K-Mag. Please advise, Mark Slade. Pit stop?
Yeah, so, we'd started the race on the wets because the Inters, it was really wet. And Montreal, it was really cold. There was no track temperature, and it's a very low load circuit, so it's very difficult to warm tyres up. So the decision was made to start both cars on the full wets, which no one else did, and it was absolutely spot on. It was the right decision. It wasn't my decision. I can't claim that, sadly. So both drivers made exceptional starts and made good progress, but Kev in particular, I think he was into the top 4 at least. Anyway, it came to the pit stop to put dry tyres on, and the guys went to the wrong stack of tyres. It was absolutely tragic. We had one of the guys, we had a new guy on the team, and unfortunately he was like the first guy to take a tyre off the stack. So even though we had the lights on the stack for the right set to be taken, for some bizarre reason, he afterwards said he thought the light was just to indicate that the tyres were heating, and he thought that we always took the first stack of tyres. And because that wasn't the case. The light was to say, fit these tyres. And he said he misunderstood what the light was for. So basically, he hadn't been educated properly. It was a mistake by the team. We hadn't prepared them. They picked the wrong set of tyres, put them on the car, and it was a disaster. So, they didn't quite put them on the car because we realised they were the wrong tyres, and then so they're the wrong tyres. So then they ran back and got the right tyres. And by that time, we'd lost a load of places. So it was just desperate.
Did Komatsu make that decision to put them on wets?
I can't remember, honestly. I just remember the message coming over the radio. I think it might have been Nico and Gary Gannon.
Okay.
I think they might have decided, because I remember the message coming across the radio. We were humming and hawing already, and the message came across, well, Nico and Gary are going with the full wets. And I thought, well, yeah, we should do as well, because I don't think we'll get the inters to work. And sure enough, they didn't. So, yeah.
Sebastian Panisi, hi Peter, enjoy when you have Mr. Slade on. They call you Mr. Slade a lot here, Mark. Very,
Aren't they? Very polite, formal.
I hope you both have a wonderful day. Hello from Tacoma, Washington. Yeah, you too. Thank you very much, Sebastian. Going back to the MTC, another question from Jotma. Why was the wind tunnel at some point not updated, and did they have to use the Toyota one? Yes, they did use the Toyota one. There were two tunnels actually at Toyota in Cologne, and they were very good, and they used that for a long time. I think they've got their own operating now. Well, they have got their own operating now. But I heard a story, I don't know whether this is true, Mark, that the early days of the McLaren wind tunnel, which was obviously subterranean at that point, were coloured enormously by the problem of having to keep the water in the pond relatively high temperature for the very exotic tropical fish that Ron had imported, and it was impossible to work in the tunnel because it was so hot and sweaty.
So I've got quite a few stories about the tunnel. I'll cover the.
I think we'll wind up the show at the end of all these as well.
Okay. So the starting point was that wind tunnel, the wind tunnel that was installed in MTC, was originally designed for the McLaren factory that never happened at Linden Hill.
Right.
And that project actually started in about 1991.
That was when Ron was also going to break the sound barrier, right?
Yes, exactly, with Bob Bell's. Yeah, can't remember the name of it, but yeah.
Yeah.
So that wind tunnel, they spent a lot of money on designing a wind tunnel, and they actually built it, and then it was put in storage because they didn't have anywhere to install it. So when MTC was built, and MTC opened in 2002, I think. So this is 10 years later. It was very expensive because of its location. It was built on basically wet, waterlogged ground. So the cost of building that facility was absolutely enormous. And I think they just decided that they would use the wind tunnel they already had, which was the one that had been designed in 1991. And it was quite a small section, which in 1991 was state of the art. But by 2002, it was much smaller than everybody was using. I think that there have been issues with section size, even with the wind tunnel they previously used, which was at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, was where McLaren had been wind tunnel testing before that. So they knew that section size was important, but I just don't think, despite McLaren being McLaren at that time, didn't have the money to build a bigger one. So the one was installed. It was actually in one of the three sections, so it wasn't underground as such. It was within one of the legs of the building, I think. But that was why it was so small, because they used an old one. And frankly, with Adrian on board, this leads me on to a bigger picture. McLaren underinvested in aero for a long time. And so when Adrian left the team in 2006, their aero side was a bit of a disaster, to be honest. In that they didn't have enough people, they didn't have enough computers, and the wind tunnel was too small. And obviously, by 2008, they'd spent a lot of money on things like fines for Spygate and other things, and there wasn't the money to upgrade it. And they went to use the Toyota tunnel because they couldn't afford to build a better tunnel at MTC. And I think MTC had been designed around the tunnel they have, and I think to put a bigger section tunnel in would have been very hard, and which is why they were talking about building a new tunnel over the road from MTC at one point, but I don't think they ever did that. And I don't even know what tunnel they use now.
I think they did build that. I think.
Did they?
Yeah,
okay.
I think that is in operation.
Finally, yeah.
Mm.
But basically,
it took a long time.
It came down to money and not investing in the right things. I'll be honest. And I think this is where I have huge respect for Ron for what he achieved, but I would say that in the 2000s and onwards, big mistakes started to be made in terms of priorities. And that led to the disaster that McLaren was by the mid sort of 2014, 15, 16. A lot of those mistakes in long-term planning came home to roost.
Great tropical fish, though.
So going back to that story, yes. I think it was hot in there. They did so they had the big pond outside the catering area, and it had like a cascade at the side that the water came down to cool it. So that's true. Ron did have fish put in the lake. And one problem was, I think they were carp, and apparently carp are triggered to breed at a particular time of the year by the water temperature rising in their native environment. The problem at MTC was that the warm water coming out of the wind tunnel was always at that temperature. So the fish were breeding like buggery. And they used to actually have to get people to come along and take fish out because there were so many of these bloody fish in the lake. So that was one problem.
I knew it was a fishy story.
Yeah. And the other problem was that algae used to grow on the sides. So Ron used to employ Eastern European people to take wheelbarrows and get in Wellington boots and walk into the lake and clean up the algae from the lake that was stopping the cooling system working properly. So that was quite amusing. That was alongside the people who also did the pebble turning in the car park, because when the pebbles alongside the walkways got dirty, they used to come along and they used to turn the pebbles over to the clean side. And then after a number of weeks, they would then employ a pebble washer to clean the pebbles alongside.
And we can go on. Last question, Mark. We'll get back to some real motor racing now. Huge Alonso fan. Can Mark go in depth about Fernando in 07 overall, specifically why he went wide 4 times at turn 1 in Canada, and Japan 07, why he was slow in the wet, performance and crash compared to Europe, and what tire pressures he ran in China? There you go.
Good. That was 19 years ago.
Yeah. I love it. That's why I love these live streams. There's got to be no other live stream in the world like this, right? This nerdy. It's just fabulous.
So I can't be too specific because, frankly, I can't remember too many of those things. What I can say is I remember standing on the grid in Montreal. We were second, Lewis was first, and I could tell that Fernando was intent on taking the lead at turn 1. I also knew that the outside of turn 1 is dirty because they run across the apex and the outside of the track never gets cleaned up. So I remember standing next to Fernando and saying, look, I know what your plan is, but remember, it's really dirty on the outside of the approach to turn 1. And if you run onto there at full speed, you'll go off. And he did, because he was psyched out by Lewis. Lewis had got into his brain, and he could not accept being slower than Lewis. This is the thing about Fernando. He cannot accept failure. It's just he cannot accept it. So when things go wrong, he just explodes with fury. And he sets his mind I cannot be beaten. This is impossible. And he will go when he's up against someone who is as good as Lewis. To beat Lewis means he has to do something impossible. And so he tried to do the impossible, and it didn't work. And then he carried on in that frame of mind. He just could not accept failure and just kept overdoing it. It was a real weakness. Japan, he just wasn't as quick as Lewis in the wet, I'm afraid. He just wasn't. And he ran wide going through, I can't remember the turn number. It was the fast right-hander before the hairpin on the in the first sector. He just ran slightly wide, got onto the wet part of the track and lost control of the car and smashed it. And if he'd finished 5th, which I think is where he was running, he would have won the championship. So that cost him. China, I don't remember it being a tire pressure thing. I just remember that, we stopped when we needed to stop to change tires. And bizarrely on Lewis's car, even though they were wearing the tires out, they kept going because they figured that what they would stay out whilst they were going quicker. And they just wore through the tires down to the canvas. And then they stopped, and then the track was damp on the pit lane entry, and he went off on the damp into the gravel at the pit lane entry before he got to the actual pit lane and couldn't get. It was just a catastrophic screw up on the pit wall in terms of giving Lewis guidance. I'm afraid was what went wrong there. But I remember, I think Lewis was quick. I don't know if we were as quick. It was close. But we did what was right for our car, and Lewis didn't. So yeah. But unfortunately, this was the thing with Fernando. He was his own man. That's how he is. That's how he was. He always will be. And there were just certain things that in his mind just cannot be changed. And being beaten by a teammate just did not compute. So the only solution is to drive faster and harder. And when you're already at the limit, you can't do that. You crash.
As SS went on to say in another question, we should do a complete live stream about just that one season, 07. I think we probably could.
Yeah.
I've put up a lovely message here that means a lot to me from Teddy Paulette, saying, happy to listen to you always, Formula One friendship for years. And that's absolutely true. Teddy Paulette, son of Andre Paulette, who was very quick driver as well. Teddy, got to know Teddy very well in the 1970 Tasman series when he had a beautiful McLaren M10A. Drove it very well. Drove for VDS, Team Van der Straten. Incredibly talented driver, Teddy, and lovely guy. So big thanks for that message, Teddy, and hope all is well with you. Miss you, absolutely. So many questions we haven't got through. Usual old story. Windsor unable to manage all the questions as he should. I'll just quickly read some of them out. So many. Thank you. I'm overwhelmed by how many great questions everybody comes up with. So yeah, we've got another one. Lots of Alonso stuff. The idea of Mercedes having a second compression chamber in the same volume is fascinating. Yeah, I told you that's a bit of a breakthrough hearing that. I mean, I know it's only supposition, so
yeah,
we don't know for sure. We should make that point. I'm just reading these out now. If you watch the 24-hour Nürburgring and then look at the debate over the tyre choice in Formula One, it's clear to see where Formula One is falling short. The drivers are supposed to drive as fast as they can and just battle it out. So yeah, a lot more about 07 again. Ferrari team now reminds me of the team when Schumacher first went there. Who do you guys think could whip that team into shape by sheer will like he did? It needs a better car, bottom line, that's what that is. But it's surprising that Freddie hasn't been able to put the right team together yet to produce that. But they're not that far away. Mark, do you think the Ferrari blown diffuser innovation has some of its disadvantage, causing wheel spin, and does it affect the recharge algorithm? Charles seems to be struggling with this in Miami. Wheel spin. You agree with that?
I'll be honest, I don't really understand the question.
No, I'm not sure I do either. Ferrari blown diffuser innovation.
If he means the blanking of the exhaust.
Yes, that's what it means, I think.
That's to help the upper rear wing, or the interaction between floor and rear wing.
Yeah.
It's got nothing to do with start performance, frankly.
Yeah.
So unless it helps spool up the turbo a bit quicker from back pressure, maybe. I don't know. I'm just guessing at the moment. I'm speculating.
Yeah.
I don't think it's got anything to do with the start performance. Starts are really hard because the power is huge and it's a real balancing act. And some are better at it than others. Kevin Magnussen was phenomenal at starts. His control ability was something I've never seen at a start. Nico, sadly, is probably the worst starter I've ever seen. Not quite sure why. But yeah, I can't relate anything that Ferrari have done to their car in terms of making it worse. I'm afraid. They've just done a better job with the turbo sizing for the circumstances, and now it's being undone by rules being changed to help other people who didn't do as good a job.
I'm going to end this with a message from Max Flashart, who pioneered my Make Corners Great Again t-shirt, which we're still thinking about putting on sale. Why not? Anyway, just says we're very lucky to have both these legends streaming and answering questions. Well, I pull out of that one and say we're very lucky to have Mark Slade. Mark, thank you so much for your time, buddy. Absolute pleasure to be doing this, and hope to get you back to do some stuff over the Canadian Grand Prix weekend very soon as well. Get your thoughts at an appropriate moment. I suppose we haven't talked about the fact that it's a sprint race as well. First time I think we've had one in Canada.
Yeah.
You're not a massive sprint race fan, are you?
Not really. I can see why for the spectators it adds element of competition and all that, but for the teams, they're actually a bit of a pain. And as an engineer, it actually reduces the amount of contribution you can make to improving the car because you have less practice. So that's why personally I didn't particularly like them. And the other thing is, from a point scoring capability, it's only points to 8th. So it just reduces the chances of less competitive cars scoring points. There's no pit stops. So basically after the first lap, they tend to be a bit boring. It doesn't float my boat, I'm afraid.
Right. Well,
and Montreal's a great track. I don't think it needs it. You normally get a good race in Montreal anyway.
Yeah.
Such a great track.
You do. And the weather always plays a part too, or usually anyway.
Yeah.
Great, Mark. Thanks so much. And thank you to the viewer for your input, your support. Absolutely brilliant. Sorry for those we didn't get to. We'll be doing another live stream fairly soon. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to Track Ninja, and to REC Watchers for their support of this channel. Big thanks to Mark Slade. And thanks again to you for watching. Be back on Friday with a look back at what happens in the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. See you then. Take care.